Hey everyone, this is Diana Davison coming to you live from Vancouver, BC in the middle of a heat wave. Now, I'm not doing my normal style video this weekend because I'm dealing with a pretty heavy topic, so I want to take my time and try and get it right the first time. There's a lot of emotions going on in the YouTube community that I engage with. That is the Men Going Their Own Way community, MGTOW. And evolutionary psychology has been a hot topic for the last week or so since JohntheOther did I guess you could call it a call out video. And he was asking people who are promoting EvoPsych to basically reassess their positions on the premise that it is pretty much a load of hooey. Now, I have to say that I agree with John, and I'm going to try and expand on some of the things that he brought up, but I'm going to try and dive a little bit deeper beyond the surface issues that people generally bring up when criticizing evolutionary psychology. And I'm going to be leaning heavily on the work of Brendan Wallace in a book called Getting Darwin Wrong: Why Evolutionary Psychology Won't Work. So first of all, this discussion doesn't have to be about nature versus nurture, and this discussion most certainly should not be about whether or not you believe in Darwin's evolutionary theory, the biological theory of evolution. You can disagree with evolutionary psychology without denying Darwin. So let's get that straight first off. Next issue is that some people say that evolutionary psychology is an extension of or revival of a thing called sociobiology. And there are very big differences that should be pointed out. One, sociobiology was a branch of science that was initiated by biologists trying to put a mantle of psychology onto their work. And it was mostly a guy who studied ants. And his work was actually quite important in the field of biology in discussing the behavior of animals, but it didn't really cross over into a legitimate science of studying humans. Evolutionary psychology is not biologists. It is psychologists putting a veneer of biology onto their work in an attempt to make themselves look more like a hard science. But one of the criticisms is that it's because sociobiology has been pretty much debunked, it's been abandoned. So they say it's just like sociobiology, but it's not. So what are the differences? That's where we're going next. Now, the main name associated with EvoPsych is Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker was basically known best because he was young for an academic, he was fairly attractive for an academic, and he had this manner of speaking where he would create sound bites that were really useful for pop sci. But he admits that in his groundbreaking book on the subject, he was mostly just parroting the work of Lena Cosmides, I hope I said that name right, and her husband, John Tooby. Now, Wallace points out that at the time that Cosmides, Tooby, and Steven Pinker were training in psychology, where at the universities, there was a battle going on between the behaviorists who were in domination at the time and the new group of people who would like to have taken over the jobs, and in fact did end up taking over the jobs of the behaviorists by creating a grand battle. And the winning side was what's called cognitivists. So evolutionary psychologists, they have based their work on the understanding of the mind developed by cognitivists. So we need to understand where cognitivists are coming from when they tell us about the nature of humans and the nature of the human mind. Cosmides and Tooby's adapted mind and Pinker's how the mind works drew heavily on other disciplines. They were largely excited by the work of AI, or artificial intelligence, and the advances being made by computer scientists in simulating a computerized mind. And they were also influenced heavily by a engineer who was working on telephone systems and created a lingo in which to discuss information and how information is processed by cables in the telephone system. And the third major influence was linguistics. One of the major influences here was Noam Chomsky, who at the time was had proposed that there is a module in the brain which handles language. And his idea was really given a lot of accolades in the community of linguistics, but it's still highly controversial. Now, Chomsky's case for a module in the mind to handle linguistics and language is the best case for a module of mind. And modularity is a really important component of evolutionary psychology. And as brilliant as Chomsky is, 50 years later, they have still not managed to convincingly confirm that this module exists. The modules in the brain, which can be seen to be more active, they don't exactly know why these things light up. And the lights on these brain scans that you see in popular science, they're actually colorized later. That's not what they really look like. It's just for grand effect to get people excited. They actually can be shown to handle more than one type of activity. They're not singularly devoted to anything specifically. But the language module has the best case, and 50 years later, they have not actually proven that it exists, and it's still a very controversial idea in the field of linguistics. So evolutionary psychology, they have used Chomsky's work to show that there are modules, and then they've expanded that to say there's massive modularity, which is why JohntheOther talks about phrenology, because prior to all of this, a long time ago, they used to think that the brain was divided into compartments, and if you felt somebody's head, you could tell what their personality was like because parts of their head connected to that part of their brain would have lumps or not have lumps and so on. And, that was discarded because it's outright just silly. But it has a very similar kind of approach to imagining what the brain looks like and how it works with phrenology. So that's one of the criticisms, but it goes deeper than that with the modularity problem. And one of those problems is the connection to artificial intelligence, or AI. So AI at the time, back in the 70s and 80s, were making amazing advances that excited psychologists because they were replicating the way the mind seems to function. But AI since that time has actually ended up kind of coming to a halt and has just recently started to pick up again in their progress. Part of the reason they did that is because they abandoned the modular mind thinking pattern. They have actually started looking at new ideas in terms of how the brain might work. So that's why AI is advancing, and that is why evolutionary psychology is not. Now, one of the other problems that EvoPsych is facing is that they believe in evolution, but only up to the Pleistocene era. So when you listen to them talk about human behavior and their explanations for why people do things like prefer green grass or like a certain kind of grill on the front of their car, they always reference the hunter-gatherer tribes from the Pleistocene era because EvoPsych believes that evolution of the mind stopped in that era. So one of the things that they need to deal with is new advances in understanding the plasticity, neuroplasticity of the human brain, and that no, the brain didn't just stop. The only reason to stop evolution of the brain back in that time period, and they say it's because evolution takes a long time, the reason to stop it is because if you want to become an expert on something, you need to freeze it to some degree so you can discuss it, so you can try and understand it and wrap your head around it in a way that, like, the human brain is so complex, human behavior is so complex, and they want to be able to explain something that's constantly moving. And their solution was to freeze it, and they froze it way back in the 50,000 BC, right? So all of us, according to EvoPsych, we're not adapting to our environment. According to EvoPsych, we are all out of place in our modern environment because we're trying to figure out where to go get berries and hunt things instead of figuring out what to do when we're at the shopping mall. Now, I bring up shopping malls because, embarrassingly, even Rebecca Watson can debunk EvoPsych in terms of that type of discussion. I'm not even going to give a link below because it's just that embarrassing. I think, though, that the part of EvoPsych that has appealed to MGTOW is that The majority of their work has been based around mating behaviors and mate selection processes. A lot of the defenses of EvoPsych will take the form of, but we know what we see. We can observe female behavior. It makes sense when they break it down in these terms. So one of the issues that I think is really important to understand with the so-called armchair analysis that JohntheOther brought up was that in EvoPsych, they say that the brain is an information processor, right? And this is self-evidently true, much like some of the things that EvoPsych may say about mate selection may look self-evidently true, but it's actually a vacuous statement. The brain is an information processor. This is foundational to EvoPsych, and all it's really telling you is that information, stuff that we know, is being processed by thinking. They're just saying that we think about stuff that we know. So to take this from just a vacuous, self-evident statement into a scientific thesis, then you have to understand how they are using these terms. So you can't just make statements about society that people can identify with and say that, oh yeah, it matches my lived experience. You need to understand what the terms mean to the scientists in terms of, is there science? So in the science of evolutionary psychology, information are bits of information like conveyed through telephone cords and conveyed in computers. They are bits, and the processing is taking place by these modular compartments in your brain. And when JohntheOther mentions a homunculus, this is fine in computer science because they have computer programmers who tell the bits of information where to go. But in the human mind, there is no human outside of it. They postulate, without wanting to admit it, that there is a little person inside of the mind, a homunculus, that takes all the information packets, your sight, all of your senses, and will magically somehow, because it's got to be magic, there's no little person in your head, tells that information which module of your mind is supposed to go to so it can be processed properly. And this is a major flaw in EvoPsych that can't be dealt with, hasn't been dealt with. And why am I so confident? Well, because computer scientists have already moved beyond in trying to replicate the human mind and artificial intelligence. And humans apparently now are just trying to keep up with the computers. But I want to end with something that I think is extremely important. And this comes from a MGTOW talk held by Stardust, hosting Karen Strawn, or Girl It's What. And at the end of this talk, around the 51-minute mark, she says something that actually proves another point that JohntheOther made, which is if you buy into this stuff, what you're doing is you're giving women an explanation, an excuse for not becoming better people. You're basically saying they can't help it. And, I'm not just summarizing. This is literally what Karen said. So here's the clip.
I had no idea what was going on, and I was starting to hate women. And then I watched a few of your videos, and I realized that, oh, women behave that way because of this, that, and the other. Okay, well, that makes sense now. I don't feel like there's this grand conspiracy to tell me that women are one way when they're really the other. No, now I'm okay. I'm okay with women because I just see them as people who behave in certain ways for reasons.
Now, seriously, is that what MGTOW wants to do? Women are like that because of reasons. Because of reasons. I've heard that expression many times, and it's not usually coming from MGTOW. It's usually MGTOW making fun of another group.